Elena Vasquez signed inheritance papers for a church nobody wanted. The building hadn't seen a congregation in 40 years, and the lawyer who handed her the keys warned her 3 times to walk away. But when Elena's Belgian Malinois, Sable, started digging at the chapel floor, they uncovered something that powerful men had killed to keep buried. The attorney's office sat on the corner of Ashford and Main, a brick building that had probably looked important 50 years ago but now just looked tired. Elena shifted in the leather chair that had cracked in too many places, watching Harrison Blackwell shuffle through papers with hands that trembled just enough to notice. "Your aunt left you St. Mercy's Church," Blackwell said, his voice carrying the practiced monotone of someone who'd delivered bad news for decades. "The property sits on 4 acres outside Ravencrest. No mortgage, no liens, no debt of any kind. Completely and entirely yours." Elena stared at the documents spread across the mahogany desk. She hadn't spoken to Aunt Margaret in 12 years. Their last conversation had ended in shouting, with Margaret calling Elena selfish for leaving Ravencrest, and Elena calling Margaret a coward for staying. Now the woman was dead, and apparently, she'd left Elena the one thing nobody in town would touch. "What's wrong with it?" Elena asked flatly. Blackwell's jaw tightened, just a fraction. "Nothing is wrong with it, per se. The structure is old. Very old. The foundation dates back to 1847, though the current building was constructed in 1889. It's been vacant since 1985. The town council has been petitioning for demolition since the early 90s. And my aunt stopped them. Your aunt had very strong feelings about that property. She visited it weekly, sometimes daily, even though she never lived there. She maintained the grounds. Paid for repairs the building didn't need. When the county tried to condemn it 3 years ago, she fought them in court and won." Elena leaned back, studying Blackwell's face. He wasn't looking at her. Hadn't looked at her directly since she'd walked in. That was lawyer trick number 1, avoid eye contact when you're hiding something. "You're telling me to refuse the inheritance." "I'm telling you," Blackwell said carefully, "that your aunt's relationship with that church was complicated. Obsessive, some would say. It consumed the last 15 years of her life. She made claims about the property that were, frankly, irrational. Paranoid, even." "What kind of claims?" Blackwell stood abruptly, gathering papers with more force than necessary. "Nothing substantiated. Nothing worth repeating. Look, Miss Vasquez, I have buyers interested in the land. They're willing to overlook the structure entirely. $300,000. Cash. Today. You sign, you walk away, and you never have to think about St. Mercy's again. $300,000 for a condemned church in the middle of nowhere." Elena had been a prosecutor for 8 years before burning out and switching to civil litigation. She knew what desperation sounded like, what it looked like when someone wanted something badly enough to overpay by a factor of 10. Who are these buyers? A development group. Very reputable. They have plans for the land. What kind of plans? That's not really relevant to. Who specifically wants to buy it? Elena pressed. Blackwell's professional mask cracked. His eyes went cold, and for just a moment, Elena saw something underneath, not annoyance, but fear. "Miss Vasquez, I strongly advise you to take this offer. Your aunt spent years fighting battles that didn't need fighting. It made her isolated. Paranoid. It ultimately killed her. Don't make the same mistake." Elena stood, reaching for the deed. "I'll think about it." "Don't think too long." Blackwell's voice had lost its professional veneer entirely. "Some doors close faster than you'd expect. And some doors shouldn't be open at all." Elena left the office with the deed in her purse and ice forming in her stomach. Men like Harrison Blackwell didn't show fear unless they were genuinely afraid. And whatever he was afraid of, it lived inside a church her aunt had died protecting. Backstory and stakes 3 to 6:30. Elena drove through Ravencrest with the windows down, letting the autumn air clear her head. The town looked exactly like it had when she'd left at 21, small, insular, the kind of place where everyone knew your business 3 days before you did. Population 4,200. One high school. 2 churches, though St. Mercy's hadn't counted as one for 4 decades. She'd grown up here, the daughter of immigrants who'd worked themselves to exhaustion running a small restaurant. Her father died when she was 16, heart attack behind the stove. Her mother followed 2 years later, cancer that spread faster than hope. Aunt Margaret had tried to keep her in Ravencrest, insisted family meant staying where you belonged. But Elena had seen what staying did to people in this town. It made them small. Made them afraid. So she'd left. Scholarship to Columbia, law school at Georgetown, prosecutor's office in Philadelphia. She'd built a life that had nothing to do with Ravencrest or the people who'd told her she'd never amount to anything. Then the panic attacks started. Then the insomnia. Then the morning she'd frozen in court, unable to speak, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but stand there while a judge called recess and her supervisor ushered her into chambers with concern that felt like pity. 6 months of therapy and medication later, Elena had taken a job at a civil firm handling contract disputes and property law. Boring work. Safe work. Work that didn't wake her at 3 a.m. with her heart hammering and sweat soaking through her sheets. Now she was back in Ravencrest, living in a rental apartment above the hardware store because her lease in Philadelphia had ended and she hadn't had the energy to find a new place. Her savings were thin, student loans had eaten most of her prosecutor's salary, and civil litigation paid a fraction of what she'd made before. $300,000 would change everything. Would let her start over somewhere new, somewhere she could breathe without feeling like she was suffocating. But Elena had spent 8 years prosecuting criminals. She knew what guilt looked like, what fear sounded like. And Harrison Blackwell had been terrified of something inside St. Mercy's Church. Sable sat in the passenger seat, alert and calm. Elena had adopted the Belgian Malinois 2 years ago from a retired K-9 program. The dog had washed out, too aggressive for police work, they'd said, though Elena suspected Sable was just too smart to take orders from idiots. Now the dog went everywhere with her, slept at the foot of her bed, and had better instincts about people than anyone Elena had ever met. "What do you think, girl?" Elena scratched behind Sable's ears. 300,000 sound too good to be true? Sable's tail thumped once against the seat. That meant yes. Or it meant the dog wanted dinner. With Sable, it was sometimes hard to tell. That evening, Elena called the one person in Ravencrest she still trusted, her college roommate, Sienna Park, who'd moved back to town 3 years ago to take over her family's medical practice. "You inherited what?" Sienna's voice carried that particular mix of disbelief and concern that good friends reserve for truly terrible decisions. "St. Mercy's. The old church off Highway 16. Silence on the other end of the line. "Then, Elena, nobody goes near that place. There are stories." "Ghost stories?" "Worse. A priest disappeared from there in 1985. Father Dominic Cortez. He'd been assigned to St. Mercy's for 3 years. One Sunday, he just wasn't there for Mass. Police searched for weeks. Never found him. Never found any evidence of foul play. He just vanished." Elena felt cold creep up her spine. What did the investigation conclude? That he'd probably run off with a woman or had a breakdown. But people who knew him said that didn't make sense. He was devoted to the church. Obsessed with it, actually. Your aunt knew him. They were close before he disappeared. How close? I don't know. But after he vanished, your aunt started visiting the church constantly. Like she was looking for something. Or guarding something. Elena thought about Blackwell's fear, about $300,000 for worthless property, about a woman who'd died protecting a building that should have been demolished decades ago. "Sienna, did my aunt ever say why she cared so much about that church?" "She wouldn't talk about it. But near the end, she told me something strange. She said, some sins are too big to confess, and some secrets are too dangerous to share. I thought the dementia was getting worse. Now I'm not so sure." After they hung up, Elena sat in her apartment staring at the deed. Every instinct screamed at her to take Blackwell's offer, sign the papers, and walk away with enough money to start over somewhere far from Ravencrest and its secrets. But she'd spent 8 years of her life prosecuting people who thought they could buy silence, who believed money and power meant they could bury the truth. She'd burned out because the system let too many of them win. If Harrison Blackwell wanted this church badly enough to offer $300,000, something inside it was worth much more. And Elena Vasquez had never been good at walking away from a fight. First visit, 6:30 to 11 o'clock. St. Mercy's Church stood at the end of a dirt road that wound through dense woods for 2 miles. Elena's sedan rattled over potholes and exposed roots, branches scraping the sides like skeletal fingers. The trees here grew too close together, blocking out the afternoon sun, turning everything gray and cold. When the church finally appeared, Elena's breath caught. The building was massive, Gothic Revival architecture with a bell tower that rose 70 feet into the sky. Stone walls covered in ivy. Stained glass windows, most broken, that once would have been beautiful. The front doors were oak, 12 feet tall, scarred with age and neglect. It looked like something out of a nightmare, or a fairy tale where nothing ended well. Elena parked and grabbed her flashlight. Sable jumped out immediately, then froze. The dog's entire body went rigid, ears flat, hackles raised. A low, continuous growl rumbled from her chest, the sound she made when sensing danger. "Easy," Elena commanded, but her hand instinctively went to the crowbar she'd brought. She'd been in enough bad situations to trust Sable's instincts completely. The front doors hung slightly open. Elena pushed one with her shoulder, and it swung inward with a groan that echoed through empty space. The smell hit her immediately, mildew, rot, and something else. Something metallic and old, like blood that had dried and been washed away but never quite disappeared. Inside, the church was gutted. Pews were gone or smashed. The altar stood empty, stripped of anything valuable. Holes in the roof let in shafts of gray light that illuminated dust hanging thick in the air. Graffiti covered the walls near the entrance, teenagers looking for thrills, probably. But deeper inside, the walls were pristine, as if someone had carefully maintained them even as everything else crumbled. Elena walked slowly down the center aisle, flashlight sweeping the shadows. Sable stayed pressed against her leg, whining softly, body tense. The dog kept looking down, ears twitching, like she heard something beneath them. Elena knelt and pressed her palm to the floor. The boards felt wrong, too hollow, too thin. She knocked with her knuckles and heard it immediately, a deep, resonant echo that suggested vast space below. Churches had basements and crypts. But this sounded like something much larger. She found the entrance behind the altar, a trapdoor set into the floor, hidden beneath years of dust and fallen plaster. The lock was new. Shiny brass that gleamed in her flashlight beam, completely out of place on a building this neglected. Elena's heart hammered. Her aunt had put that lock there. Recently. She used the crowbar to break it open. The door lifted with a groan, revealing stone steps descending into absolute darkness. Cold air rushed up, carrying that metallic smell stronger now, unmistakable and wrong. Elena pulled out her flashlight and started down. Sable refused to follow. The dog stood at the top of the stairs, whining, every instinct screaming danger. "Stay," Elena commanded, though part of her wanted to listen to Sable's warning. The stairs were ancient, older than the church by decades, maybe centuries. Carved stone worn smooth where countless feet had walked. This wasn't a simple basement. This was something that had existed long before St. Mercy's was built, something the church had been constructed to hide. At the bottom, Elena found herself in a tunnel. Rough stone walls. Low ceiling. No modern construction, no electric lights. Just carved rock extending beyond her flashlight's reach. She followed it carefully, counting steps, 50, 75, 100. The tunnel curved gradually, always descending. Her breath came faster. How deep was this? How far did it go? At 140 steps, the tunnel opened into a chamber. And Elena Vasquez understood exactly why her aunt had died guarding this place, why Harrison Blackwell had offered $300,000, and why some secrets in Ravencrest had been worth killing for. The chamber was circular, maybe 40 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadow. But the architecture wasn't what made Elena freeze, wasn't what stopped her breath in her throat. It was the gold. Everywhere. Gold bars stacked against the walls, each marked with symbols Elena didn't immediately recognize, ecclesiastical markings, Catholic imagery. Wooden crates filled with coins, so many that some had spilled across the stone floor like water. Religious artifacts, crucifixes, chalices, candlesticks, even a monstrance that probably belonged in a museum, all solid gold, covered in dust but unmistakable. Elena's hands shook as she picked up one of the bars. Heavy, cold, absolutely real. She checked another. Same markings. A third showed different symbols but the same quality. This wasn't fake. This wasn't some elaborate hoax. This was a fortune. Tens of millions of dollars, at minimum. Then she saw the ledger. It rested on a stone shelf carved into the wall, bound in cracked leather that crumbled slightly when she touched it. Elena opened it carefully, the pages brittle with age and moisture. The entries were handwritten, dated, meticulous. Names, amounts, locations. The earliest entry was from 1847, the same year St. Mercy's foundation had been laid. Elena's legal training kicked in automatically, parsing the entries, understanding their significance. This wasn't treasure. This was systematic theft spanning over a century and a half. Donations meant for churches across 3 states, diverted and hidden. But it wasn't just historical crime. The recent entries, written in shaking handwriting she recognized as her aunt's, showed the operation had continued into the present day. Account numbers. Transfer records. Names of people still alive and powerful in Ravencrest. Harrison Blackwell, attorney. Richard Strand, mayor. Captain Owen Briggs, police chief. 3 members of the town council. Father Anthony Morales, current priest at St. Luke's, the only functioning Catholic church in Ravencrest. Elena's blood went cold as she kept reading. The amounts weren't small. Over the past 15 years alone, nearly $8 million had been donated through various channels and ended up here. And the system was still active. The most recent entry was dated 2 weeks ago. Then she found her aunt's final entry, written in letters that shook across the page. Father Cortez tried to stop them. They made him disappear. I stayed silent to stay alive. God forgive me. God forgive us all. If you're reading this, trust no one. They'll kill to protect this. They already have. Elena heard footsteps above. Sable's bark echoed down the stairwell, sharp, urgent, warning. Then a voice called down, smooth and familiar, Miss Vasquez? I thought I might find you here. We need to discuss that property sale I mentioned. Harrison Blackwell had come to make sure St. Mercy's secrets stayed buried. And Elena was standing in a tomb with only one way out. First confrontation, 1530 to 2000 hours. Elena closed the ledger and slipped it inside her jacket. Her prosecutor's instincts took over, assess the threat, identify exits, calculate options. The tunnel had only one entrance, and Blackwell was blocking it. But she had youth, training, and Sable at the top of those stairs. More importantly, she had 8 years of experience dealing with criminals who thought they could intimidate her. She climbed quickly, flashlight off, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness. At the top, Sable's growls had intensified to something between warning and promise. Elena emerged into the chapel to find Blackwell standing 30 feet away, hands in his coat pockets, looking more sad than threatening. You shouldn't have come here, he said quietly. My property, Elena replied, voice steady. I can be here whenever I want. Your aunt said the same thing. Insisted on her rights right up until the heart attack that killed her. Blackwell's eyes drifted to the open trapdoor. Did you find what she was protecting? Elena said nothing, just studied him. Blackwell looked older than he had this morning, more tired. Like a man carrying weight for too long. I'll make this very simple, Blackwell continued. I have buyers who will pay $500,000 for this property. Cash. Today. You sign, walk away, and forget you were ever here. You can start fresh anywhere you want. No more struggling in that apartment above the hardware store. No more wondering if you made the right choice leaving Philadelphia. 500,000. The number had doubled in less than 12 hours. That confirmed everything Elena had just read in that ledger. That's extremely generous, she said carefully. It's more than generous. It's survival. You burned out as a prosecutor, Miss Vasquez. I know why. I know about the panic attacks, the anxiety, the cases that broke you. This money lets you heal. Lets you start over without that weight. The fact that he knew those details should have frightened her. Instead, it made her angry. These people had been watching her, preparing for this moment since her aunt died. And if I want time to think about it? Time is what you don't have. Blackwell pulled his hand from his pocket, not a weapon, a phone. I can have the papers drawn up in an hour. Or I can make a different call. One that brings people far less reasonable than I am. Your aunt understood the stakes. She stayed quiet for 15 years because she knew what would happen if she didn't. She stayed quiet because you threatened her. Because you made Father Cortez disappear when he tried to expose you. Blackwell's mask cracked. Fear and anger flashed across his face. Be very careful with accusations, Miss Vasquez. Ravencrest has long memories. People remember what happens to troublemakers. Ask your aunt. Oh wait, you can't. Heart attack. Very sudden. Very tragic. Sable's hackles were raised, teeth bared. The dog sensed the shift from threat to promise of violence. Elena made her decision in that moment. She could take the money and run, spend the rest of her life wondering if her aunt had been murdered, if Father Cortez had been killed for doing the right thing. Or she could do what she'd been trained to do, fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. I need until tomorrow morning, she said. Let me think it over. Blackwell studied her for a long moment. Elena kept her expression neutral, gave nothing away. Finally, he nodded slowly. Tomorrow. Noon. My office. Don't make me come looking for you again, Miss Vasquez. And don't do anything foolish like going to the police. Captain Briggs is a reasonable man who understands how this town works. He left, footsteps echoing on the stone floor, then crunching on gravel outside. Elena waited until she heard his car start, waited until the engine sound faded completely into the distance. Then she pulled out her phone and photographed every page of the ledger. Every name. Every amount. Every piece of evidence. Her aunt's final words stared up at her from the last page, trust no one. They'll kill to protect this. Elena looked down at Sable. The dog had finally relaxed, pressing against her leg, brown eyes watching her with complete trust. We're not staying quiet, Elena said softly. And we're not running. She had until noon tomorrow. That gave her 18 hours to figure out who else was involved, how deep this went, and whether there was anyone in Ravencrest she could trust with a conspiracy that had murdered before and wouldn't hesitate to murder again. Because one thing was absolutely certain, Harrison Blackwell hadn't come alone to make threats. And when Elena didn't show up tomorrow to sign those papers, they'd come back with more than words. The gold beneath St. Mercy's Church had already cost Father Cortez his life and her aunt's freedom. Elena wasn't planning to be the next victim. She carefully returned the ledger to its shelf in the chamber below, sealing the trapdoor and scattering debris across it to make it look undisturbed. If something happened to her, at least the evidence would still exist. She'd uploaded the photos to 3 separate cloud storage accounts with instructions to release them automatically if she didn't check in every 24 hours. As she drove away from St. Mercy's, Elena didn't notice the pickup truck parked in the woods a quarter mile down the road, or the man inside with binoculars taking pictures of her license plate and calling someone whose name appeared 17 times in that ledger. The people who'd hidden $30 million in gold for over a century didn't make mistakes. And they didn't leave loose ends alive. Elena had 18 hours to expose them or become just another tragic accident in a town very good at covering up the truth. The question was, who could she trust in a place where everyone seemed to be on someone's payroll? And what would she do when she discovered the gold was just the beginning, that beneath St. Mercy's Church lay secrets far darker than simple theft? Elena had found $30 million in gold beneath St. Mercy's Church, and evidence of a conspiracy spanning generations. Harrison Blackwell had given her until noon to sign away the property or face consequences. But Elena Vasquez had spent 8 years prosecuting criminals. She wasn't about to let them win now. Gathering allies at 0:30 to 2 o'clock. Elena spent the night in her apartment, Sable at her feet, studying the photographs she'd taken of the ledger. Every name. Every transaction. The pattern was clear: donations meant for legitimate charities, diverted through shell companies, hidden beneath a church nobody dared enter. At dawn, she called Sienna Park. "I need your help," Elena said. "And I need you to trust me without asking questions yet." Sienna was silent for a moment. "How much trouble are you in?" "Enough that if something happens to me, you need to send these files to the FBI. Elena sent the cloud storage login credentials. "Don't open them unless I don't contact you by tonight." "Elena, what did you find in that church?" "Proof that Father Cortez didn't disappear. He was murdered. And my aunt knew who did it." Another pause. "Then, what do you need?" "Witnesses. People who've been hurt by Blackwell and his friends. People angry enough to speak up if they know they're not alone." Sienna gave her 3 names. Families who'd lost property under suspicious circumstances. People who'd asked questions and been threatened into silence. Elena spent the morning visiting them, speaking quietly, showing just enough of the evidence to prove she wasn't crazy. Not everyone agreed. Fear ran deep in Ravencrest. But 3 people said yes. 3 people decided silence had lasted long enough. By 11:30, Elena had something resembling a plan. It wasn't perfect. It probably wouldn't work. But it was better than signing away the truth. The confrontation, 2 to 3:30. Elena didn't go to Blackwell's office at noon. Instead, she went to the Ravencrest Gazette, the small newspaper run by Marcus Chen, a journalist who'd been asking uncomfortable questions about town finances for years. She laid out everything. The gold. The ledger. The names. The pattern of theft and murder. Marcus stared at the photographs, his hands shaking. "If we publish this, they'll come after us." "They're already coming after me," Elena said. "The question is whether we let them win." At 12:15, Blackwell called her phone. Elena didn't answer. At 12:30, he called again. This time she picked up. "You were supposed to be at my office," Blackwell said, voice tight with controlled anger. "I changed my mind about selling." "That's unfortunate." "Very unfortunate." "Where are you, Miss Vasquez?" "Somewhere public. Somewhere with witnesses. You should know, I've made copies of everything I found. If something happens to me, those files go to the FBI, the state police, and every major newspaper in the region." Silence on the other end. "Then, you're making a serious mistake." "My aunt made a mistake by staying silent. Father Cortez made a mistake by trusting you people. I'm not making the same mistake." She hung up. The trap, 3:30 to 4:30. They came for her at sunset. Elena was back at St. Mercy's, waiting with Sable and 3 other people, Sienna, Marcus, and David Torres, a former police officer who'd been forced out for asking too many questions about Captain Briggs. 2 vehicles pulled up. 6 men got out, including Blackwell and Captain Briggs. They weren't trying to hide anymore. "Last chance, Miss Vasquez," Blackwell called out. "Sign the property over. Walk away. We'll forget this ever happened." "I want to show you something first," Elena said. She led them inside, down into the chamber, let them see the gold they'd been protecting. But she also let them see the cameras she'd set up. The live stream broadcasting to Marcus's newspaper website. The 3 witnesses recording everything on their phones. Blackwell's face went white. "Turn those cameras off. Now." "No," Elena said calmly. "You wanted to keep this secret. I'm making sure the whole world sees it." Briggs reached for his weapon, but David Torres already had his gun drawn. "I wouldn't," Torres said quietly. Resolution 4:30 to 5 o'clock. It took 3 hours for the FBI to arrive. By then, Marcus's story had been shared 10,000 times. The evidence was everywhere, impossible to suppress, impossible to deny. Harrison Blackwell was arrested along with 5 others. Captain Briggs tried to run and made it 12 miles before state police caught him. The investigation would take months, but the conspiracy was broken. Elena stood outside St. Mercy's Church as the sun rose, Sable pressed against her leg. The gold would be returned to its rightful owners, or their descendants. The church would finally be demolished. And Ravencrest would have to face the truth it had buried for generations. Sienna walked up beside her. "What now?" Elena smiled. "Now I finish what my aunt and Father Cortez started. I make sure everyone responsible pays." She had found more than gold beneath St. Mercy's. She'd found her purpose again. And this time, she wasn't running. 6 months later, Elena Vasquez opened her own law practice in Ravencrest. She specialized in cases nobody else wanted, people fighting corruption, families seeking justice against powerful institutions. The work was hard. The pay was terrible. But every night, she slept without panic attacks. And Sable never left her side.